Hi folks, it's me, the hairy one, and here to talk about Richard Lehman again, with book number 30 on my ranking list. Now, I've mentioned there was quite a few books that were all within the sort of bad spectrum that I sort of lumped together, and we're sort of going past that point now. These next few books are all going to be between the sort of disappointing and middling sort of thing, but they're not necessarily bad books. And for number 30, the first one on this list, I've chosen No Sanctuary from 2001. Now, this was, I believe, the second book to be released after Lehman's death. The first being Night in the Lonesome October. And this one is an interesting one because this is a book that, in fact, this is the only one of these post night books that have been released that you can still buy a mass market paperback edition of, because the following three books that were released after this you can't get apart from I think in the double editions, but they just never reprinted them as single paperbacks. Not quite sure why, because they would have sold. But No Sanctuary, released in 2001, is a posthumous Richard Lehman book. And again, so the question first is, did Richard Lehman write this, being as it was released after his death? I think the answer to that is yes. This definitely feels like a Richard Lehman release. And I have several reasons why I think this more than any of the other books, the other three that followed, one of which I've already spoke about, The Lake, is likely to be a book. And that's because this was released the same year that Richard Lehman died. I don't believe that his family would have grieved for long enough to then put out a book under his name. I don't believe that his editors would have had time to, scramble together a new book out of old ideas the same year he died. I don't believe anyone would have thought that was morally or ethically a right thing to do anyway. If you look at the other books that came out after this, there was at least, a 2 or 3 year gap from this until those books got released, which gave somebody else time to sort of work on them. I said with the Lake came out in 2004, and there's a lot of Richard Lehman stuff in there, but I also think there's a lot of sort of rewriting and editing and splicing of other bits. So I've already said my part on the Lake. It's the same with some of the other books as well. But this one I don't believe is quite that thing. But I also don't believe that this is necessarily a finished book. It's got two very different strands, and what I think has happened is that Strand 1 is definitely something that Richard Lehman was writing and had put on the back burner, or was possibly rejected. Like I say, he had a lot of rejected novels. And part 2 is something that Richard Lehman was working on an idea for, and the two have just been spliced at the end together. So I'll explain what I mean. So part 1 of this story, the good bit of the story, is about this girl who likes to break into people's homes and live there. She stays. She's a bit like an unwanted squatter. She stays at the house. She likes the thrill of not being identified. If somebody else sees her at the house, she pretends she's a relative. She finds places where people have gone on holiday and stays in their homes, basically. And she gets a thrill out of it. And it's an odd thing to do, but it's interesting that she does. She meets the neighbours. She'll talk to people, and then she'll move on somewhere else. And over the course of this story, she breaks into this home of a serial killer, and she doesn't initially know this, but then she comes to realise that this is a serial killer's house. And then she gets caught by the serial killer, who wants to do Lehman-esque things to her. That's the first part of the story. It's not badly written. It does feature the usual sort of bizarre. She meets the neighbour and falls instantly in love, and it's got a lot of that going on. But it's not a bad story. It's not a horror story for the most part. 3/4 of this are really just an interesting story about somebody breaks into somebody's homes. The final part of it, when she meets this serial killer, is a horror story in a sense, but it's quite a mild one by layman's standards. The other thread of this sees these two characters who are described as, I think, they're in their late 20s, and they've got quite good jobs and things, but they decide to go camping. The reason why I mention the age is because they feel, in how they're written, like teenagers, but they're not. They're adults. And they go camping. He doesn't want to go camping because something tragic happened to his stepmom when he was young, when they went camping, and he's got a phobia of camping. But she's very headstrong. She wants to go camping, and he's going because he loves her and he cares about her and he wants to look brave in front of her. And when they go camping, they run into some bizarre adventures. There's a bit in which they encounter these two girls who our hero suddenly falls in love with and fantasizes about, even though he already has a girlfriend that he's only in a place he doesn't want to be because he loves her, but he also then likes this girl and believes one of them likes him. Bit of a ridiculous twist on their story later on, which just felt very contrived, very typically Layman. They also meet these teenage boys, which set alarm bells off because that's kind of connected to why this guy doesn't like camping. And these guys, unusually for Layman, have a bit of a sort of twist in terms of their story, and they're not necessarily what they seem. And I kind of like that element. Yeah, the writing here is definitely Layman. He wrote all of this stuff, is what I'm trying to say to you. But these two threads have nothing in common. They both seem to be very devoid of horror. They both seem to be very much character-focused stories, but they don't initially seem to be leading anywhere. The story with the girl breaking the homes is a bit more interesting, but neither of them are particularly exciting or thrilling or visceral action. They've both got, sex and, some oddities going on, but they don't seem initially all that great. It's not really until you get to the second half of the book where really anything seems to happen. The two campers fall upon this really strange guy who keeps these savage dogs, who decides he's going to try and torch them. And that bit feels like it was a short story that Layman's sort of had thrown in there, an idea he had that's very separate from the story, because it's got nothing to do with anything else. It's just shoehorned in there. And when I say that Layman wrote this, I feel like Layman's wrote 90% of this book, but maybe somebody at his estate has sort of like taken some of these ideas and put them together a bit, because it's just there to give the story some action. They sort that out, very weird. And then things come to a head at the end where this girl who's kidnapped by this serial killer and these two campers sort of meet in a really contrived, sort of very sudden way, and the story's over before you know it. It feels very spliced together, is what I'm saying, and not necessarily that this was necessarily one story. It's a collection of two stories with some other story thrown in, but nothing really happens. It's quite slow. It's quite tame. It's not really filled with all the mad stuff that Layman put in his books, and it all feels a little bit sort of haphazard and half-arsed. This definitely feels like something that Layman was writing, the bare bones of a story, where he intended at some point to throw other things in. So he's done a first draft of a couple of ideas, and he thought, well, I'm going to now throw in far more serial killer stuff. I'm going to throw in more weird stuff in the woods, but he just never got round to it. And somebody, whether it's a family member, it's in the state, has then taken that, spliced it together, and it's been published as a book because it was the most complete thing he had after his death, that he'd been working on, that they thought the fans would want to read. And I get it, I understand some Layman fans are very diehard. It's nice to have a complete work. And it's not an awful book. It's not bad. Certainly not a bad book. But it's largely a bit of an aimless, rambling nothingness, really. There's not, like I said, there's not an awful lot that happens. There's not a lot really to say about it. It's a very minor work that doesn't say, it's nowhere near as interesting as Premise, and there really isn't much to talk about. It's a very sort of vague, very rambling, bit like me, book that doesn't really go anywhere or do anything. Not an awful lot happens. It's got no major scenes, no major characters. It's just very slight, and it's not something you're really going to remember much. It's certainly not going to be anyone's favourite book. So I've put it at number 30 because it's not bad. And it's nice to have a posthumous Layman novel, of which we've got a few others to talk about. We've already spoken about one. It's not definitely like 50% ghost written like I think The Lake was, and it's better constructed than that. But it's just a bit nothingnessy. It's just a bit aimless, really. But it is what it is. So that's No Sanctuary from 2001, in at number 30.